Hey there, kindred spirits. Welcome to Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. I'm Kelly Gerner. I'm here with my co-host, Ragon Duffy, and our friend and previous guest, Brenna Clarke Gray. Hey, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Brenna. Hi, Ragon.
Hi, guys.
So today's episode is focused on Anne of Green Gables, the Anne series kind of as a whole, and Ellen Montgomery, but like very specifically in the context of Canadian culture. Since Ragon and I are from the United States, this is not something that we are really qualified to talk about at all. So we decided to recruit some of our absolute favorite past guests to help us talk about Canadian culture, identity, and Anne.
So in this episode, you're going to hear from some of our favorite scholars, actors, and artists. But first, we're going to spend a lot more time because we are excited to welcome back our friend Brenna Clarke Gray. And we're so glad you came back to the pod, Brenna.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. So, yeah, my name is Brenna. I'm a research professor at a very small university in British Columbia here in Canada, in the ancestral lands of the Tk'emlúps Sequebin people within Sequebin Ulu. I used to be a Canadian literature specialist. That's what my PhD is in. But these days, my field is educational technologies, and it's a long story to explain how I got here, so I won't. But I'm still an avid reader of CanLit, and actually my very first book and my last CanLit project ever is about to come out in September, The Routledge Introduction to Canadian Comics. I'm also a mom of two, a committed YA reader and podcaster. I make a show with my friend Joe called Hazel and Katniss and Harry and Star, and I'm an enthusiastic, if only semi-competent baker.
Enthusiasm covers a lot of sins, Brenna.
Really does.
You don't need to be competent when you're enthusiastic. That's how we approach podcasting.
That's kind of my motto for life.
Brenna, you have a book coming out? Tell us more.
Do. Yeah, so I started it, oh god, I don't know, a really long time ago, but it's part of a series of, so Routledge is a scholarly publisher in the UK. They're doing a series that's specifically about Canadian literature, some introductions to different aspects. So yeah, I wrote the introduction to Canadian comics, which is so exciting, and I'm actually just working through the copy edits right now, and allegedly it will be out in September.
So cool.
Yeah, it's super fun.
That is exciting. Well, congratulations on that project.
Thanks.
Congratulations on your expanding family.
Aw,
Last time you were here, you were a mom of one, and now you are a mom of two.
Yes.
So.
Not only was Brenna a mom of one and pregnant, though we did not know it at the time, with her second one, we made her come on the podcast and talk about Anne's pregnancy and loss. And sorry.
I remember seeing your pregnancy announcement not long after that, and I was like, oh, we screwed up.
My favorite part of that episode is there's a moment where Kelly says something akin to, no one ever gets spontaneously pregnant at 42. And I was like, or.
Like, good time.
Maybe.
You know, it's all good. Anyway, much like Anne, I had a series of pregnancy losses, and so I wasn't talking about it at that time because I didn't think they would be sticking around, but he's here, and he's very healthy and happy and loud and rambunctious because he's now 21 months old.
Congratulations. That's so fun.
Yeah,
amazing. And for our listeners, if you don't remember first of all, you should go back and listen to our episodes with Brenna, which were in our Anne's House of Dreams episodes.
My favorite book.
We also had her to come talk about planning our trip to Prince Edward Island 2 years ago, which was amazing.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't remember, we've been friends with Brenna, never in person, only online, but she has been part of Kelly and my friendship origin story of meeting on the soap forum many a year ago.
Guys, no joke, I think it's been 20 years.
Wow, it would be 20 years. Yeah, you're right.
We were such babies.
Wow. I was listening to some kind of podcast and it was all about scams, like online scams. It got me thinking about how many scams we were witness to on that forum.
Yes.
Oh my God. People were faking every kind of disease in the book and everything else. And people were also, why was our go-to to send soap to people when it's been wrong?
They're going through a hard time. Let's send soap.
Here's a $4 bath bomb for your troubles.
And there's something about it where it's like, oh, here's like a bunch of like nice ladies who love expensive soap. I'm going to like invent some terrible illness or like misfortune that has befallen my whole family so I can collect upon their largesse. In retrospect, it's like the silliest thing ever.
You know, The youth do not understand how much better the internet was before Facebook.
God, they really don't.
Like,
They're
when
missing out.
you had to like join a forum full of like half really nice, interesting people and half absolute nut jobs.
Yep.
And you'd have this common thing in common, but also there'd always be like a handful of people with either just terribly tragic backstories or good creative writing skills, one or the other. And regardless of your special interests, they would gravitate to these groups. And like, it's so much better than what we have now, which I know sounds terrible to say.
I don't know, the content
Yes.
is so...
The entertainment value of
Yeah.
the forum. Like, I was not
There's
even
nothing like it. TikTok
No.
has nothing on a forum in 2005. Truly.
No.
The chronically
Amazing.
online do grow up.
We all do eventually, right? Like in 20 years, the Snapchat kids or whatever it is that they're doing, they'll be reminiscing on their own.
Oh, they really will. Yeah. The golden days of Snapchat.
It's a wild time.
Wild time. Ugh.
Well, before we jump into the podcast proper, we just want to remind all of you that we're not just a podcast, we're a book club, and you are part of it. If you haven't yet, leave us a 5-star rating or a quick review. That's one of the best ways to support what we're building here. You can also come hang out with us on Instagram at kindredspirits.bookclub. We're always chatting about books, sharing behind the scenes. We love to hear about what you're reading. And if you want to go one step further, you can shop our bookshop.org page. It supports indie bookstores and it gives the podcast a small commission, which helps us keep making these episodes. So it's a win-win-win. But now on to the episode.
So for our story club, the I think inciting incident of this podcast was actually grew out of our attendance at the Ella Montgomery Institute's conference in 2024. I remember that one of the panelists referred to Anne of Green Gables as the great Canadian novel. And I had this really interesting moment where it sort of like stopped me in my tracks. Like I just hadn't thought of it that way. And it was very surprising on a couple of levels for me. And the first level being just admitting sheepishly that this is me being very American, where we sort of expect to be the cultural center of every conversation. But I had this moment of feeling like an outsider in a fandom that had always felt my home. Almost that I hadn't even realized that the world of Anne of Green Gables wasn't explicitly part of my cultural heritage, which that's on me. I mean, that's I take that. But then as I was kind of unpacking it a little bit, I was sort of thinking, well, if this is the great Canadian novel or one of them, what does that say about Canada? And then just realizing in that moment that I just don't know enough about Canada, about Canadian culture and history to really understand even sort of the premise of that question. So, and I was comparing it to my understanding of like great American novels and how and why those connect back to American history and culture and identity. And typically when you think of the great American novel, these are these books that feel like uniquely American. They couldn't be written by someone who didn't experience life in the United States. So I think a lot of people think of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. That is like basically a textbook for how capitalism and envy and desire color the American psyche. And then we also have books like The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck and Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And those capture these really specific moments in American history that have also kind of come to define our national identity. But, you know, I just didn't know enough about Canada to understand what it was that would make Anne of Green Gables their great Canadian novel. So that's kind of where I wanted to start. I wanted to examine that notion that this book is the great Canadian novel, and if it is, why? So, Brenna, not to lay the heaviest question right at your feet, but you are the resident Canadian, so tell us what you think.
I think it's a great question. I am gonna immediately problematize it as a question. And
perfect. That's why you're here.
I think a lot of Canadian literature scholars would reject the notion that Canada has or even can have a singular sort of great novel. In general, Canada has, to a certain extent, at least superficially, rejected the idea of cultural homogeneity. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar. It's a common expression here to note the differences between Canada and the US, being that the US has traditionally valued being a melting pot, whereas Canada has traditionally valued being seen as a cultural mosaic. The extent to which that's actually true in real life is probably hugely debatable. I would definitely defer to new immigrant communities about their experiences. But if we consider the founding cultures of Canada to be the existing Indigenous nations at the time of contact, followed by the French and then the English, and this really unique relationship between French and English Canada, right? So we have the Battle for the Plains of Abraham in 1760. French culture is a sort of on some level vanquished in that battle, but then not. New France is allowed to continue having Lower Canada as this sort of significant French population. The French were not culturally dominated in the same way we might expect. We see expulsions in places like Acadia, but not in Quebec proper. So what single novel can speak to all of those cultural experiences, right? They're pretty dramatically different. And, some people might name like Hugh MacLennan has a novel called Two Solitudes that's explicitly about this French and English, this isolation that exists. But, that novel leaves out Indigenous experience entirely. So I guess this is an important point too. I realize that throughout we're talking about Canadian culture, but overwhelmingly we're talking about English Canadian culture, right? Like French Canadian culture is a whole other thing. It has a very robust star system of its own. It has a pop culture framework that doesn't need the same kind of protectionist policies that we're going to talk about like in English Canada. And then the other piece, to continue to not answer your question, is multiculturalism has been the official government policy in Canada since 1971, and it's been the law of the land since 1988. So that means that minority populations within Canada are legally recognized, protected, and promoted. Canada was the first country to ever take that step. What single story could capture like that multiplicity of expression, right? Like there's just so much going on. And it's not to say that there's in any way more diversity in Canada than the US, because there isn't. But there is a resistance towards the idea of a single narrative. And I think without a single dominant cultural narrative, it's hard to have a great Canadian novel. Okay, but all that said, as an example of early global literary success and as a version of the story of Canada that has persisted, obviously Anne is hugely important. And I think too, its significance, if you understand the publishing landscape in 1908, it can be helpful as well. Like the cultural position of Canadian literature, English Canada exists in conversation with, but also in opposition to both British and American cultures. But there's also like a deep sense of inferiority in that position. Canlit wasn't even a field of study that you could like take a degree in until the 1960s and 70s.
Oh, wow.
And our universities were predominantly British and American, particularly around literary scholarship. The idea that there was anything worthy of study or discussion that was happening here was like, which is very much a colonial mindset, right? You look to the mother country for culture. So for all of those reasons, the idea of a global juggernaut of a book title, appreciated and studied the world over, like that makes Anne important because Canadians like things that people recognize globally as Canadian. Like it's the same reason why we like Ryan Reynolds, right? Like people know he's Canadian and he tells people he's Canadian and we like that. Same thing with Anne. Anne is obviously the very first literary title in Canadian history to cross over into like pop culture phenom. And so for that reason, even if I have gone on this long circuitous roundabout to tell you it's not the great Canadian novel because there isn't one, I do obviously think it's very important.
Well, because I think there is something about this idea of a book that becomes worldwide, a book that comes to represent something specific about its nation or its culture in some way. So it sounds like in that way, that is what Anne of Green Gables is, even if, of course, Canada is far too wide and big and broad to be contained
too
in a single
woke.
book. So Kate Scarth, who is the chair of the Ellen Montgomery Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island, she asked us specifically what it is like to read and love this book as Americans, which, that's an interesting question. So Kelly, what does that mean to you?
And again, I sort of started this conversation like acknowledging my Americanness. And so for me, like reading this series as a kid, genuinely, it barely even registered to me that the books were set in Canada or specifically Canadian. So with truly like deep apologies to all of our Canadian listeners, but reading them in childhood, all I knew is like they were in English, and the world that they depicted and the values and social norms of that world didn't strike me as particularly unfamiliar. So much English language literature is set in the United States, particularly kidlit, and particularly the kinds of books I was reading at that time. So I don't think I was engaged at all with the idea that these characters lived in another country. It was very easy to slot Avonlea in my imagination as like any kind of like northeastern coastal village in North America. Avonlea didn't feel any more or less relevant to me. And then reading as an adult, obviously that changed a lot, specifically in the context of this podcast. But I think what's interesting is that I engage with the novel's Canadianness now from like a historical and geographical perspective. The research on like where specific places mentioned in these books are or are based on. And I've spent a lot of time researching like historical details, like for example, around women's suffrage in Canada. Over the course of the podcast, I think I've engaged with the book's Canadianness a lot more, but in this very sort of historical sense. So, Ragon, how about you?
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with your experience. I thought of Anne in the same genre as Little Women or The Secret Garden. So familiar-ish because English-speaking world, but not familiar because of the historical era it was written in. Like I kind of took anything I didn't understand as a product of the historical era, not as culture or not as a nation. And Anne was that same mix of familiar and not familiar because of the fact that it was old. And it was a much different time. I didn't particularly think of it as specifically Canadian, except for some of the specific references that Anne makes to being very proud to be a Canadian. And also like, I didn't understand some of the political references in it, but I didn't understand some of the political references in Little Women or things like that if I wasn't familiar with some of that historical context. Brenna, how about you reading Anne as a Canadian kid? Did you feel any special connection to or kinship with Anne?
I don't think like legally you can be a kid in Canada and not know in your books that Anne is Canadian. She's just such a part of the atmosphere here. And I think until fairly recently, Anne was important because she might have been the only Canadian character that a young person came into contact with. That has probably shifted now. There are so many Canadian middle grade and children's writers having a lot of success right now. So my hope is that that is changing, although my big kid only reads books about dragons and I don't know who's writing those. But other than Anne, like I was reading Babysitter's Club and like Sweet Valley Twins. Like there weren't a lot of other Canadian characters in my orbit. We absorb so much American popular culture and literature. So when you read about Anne's experiences, whether it's like how she deals with winter weather or her machinations over the Grits versus the Tories, which were still words that we use today to describe the two main political parties, or her ideas about confederation, like it's just nice. Like it's nice to see your understanding of the world reflected back to you on the page. But I do think everybody knows her as a Canadian heroine when they read her here.
So I think then the next question to ask non-Canadian readers, including ourselves, to think about is whether or how we can claim Anne for ourselves.
Yeah. So, and I think this is such an interesting question because, like, on the one hand, any book character that anyone connects to, of course, you can claim kinship with them. Anyone can feel at home in Avonlea and at Green Gables. And very specific to Anne, you know, this book has been translated into 36 languages. It has been adapted in media across the globe. And so we know, just like practically, individually speaking, our love for Anne does not stop at any kind of a national border. But, you know, I do think that there are like elements to Anne, like Anne Shirley herself as a cultural figure that seem to belong in Canada. I'm like very specifically thinking about like the imagery of Anne, right? And Prince Edward Island and the Anne of Green Gables like tourism economy, that image of the young girl with red braids and the straw hat, and all that just seems to belong to that place in a really specific way. Although, even as I'm thinking this, I'm realizing, of course, that's our podcast logo. So now, perhaps, Ragon, have we stolen from Canada? Do we owe PEI reparations?
Maybe a little, but guys, this podcast doesn't make any money, so
yeah, don't sue us.
But I think that's Anne's iconography, right? The hat, the braids, the pinafore, no matter where she is, like that's how you know it's Anne specifically. It's like Dorothy and the ruby slippers and the blue and white checked dress. That's what tells you it's Dorothy specifically. Yeah, so I don't think we can be an Anne of Green Gables podcast without the image of Anne and with her braids in her hat. Like I think it's illegal.
Might be.
But to your other point, I do think that, yeah, that's the point of literature, that you can find yourself or your experience in a fictional character and find kinship there. And Anne in particular speaks to many people about that feeling of being unwanted and unloved, and then finding the place and the people who embrace you and where you can be yourself and where you can be at home. And I think anyone who sees themselves in Anne in some way can claim her and can claim kinship with her. But also we can respect that she's specific to Canada and not erase what makes her specific to Canada in our kinship with her, right? We don't have to erase that in order to feel kinship with her. Just as we can and should find ourselves in characters from lots of different nations, from many eras and many cultures, we can embrace our similarity and still respect what's specific to that character's culture. Like, you don't have to identify with every single thing in order to identify with the character. And I think maybe in our previous reading lives, we might have erased some of Anne's Canadianness because we didn't spend enough time thinking about or appreciating Canada as separate from us. And I think Americans kind of do this to Canada a lot, you know, Canada, it's America, but nicer.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a real vibe here right now that like everybody's kind of lost patience with the like Canada as exit plan narrative, right?
Oh, like, fair, very fair.
And right, it's because we share a lot of language and we share a lot of history, and our borders have been pretty porous historically. That's not really fair to Canada, and it really shows the self-centeredness of the United States for sure. And I do think getting to spend so much time deep diving into Ella Montgomery's books, getting to learn from so many amazing Canadian experts has given us a much more nuanced appreciation and perspective on Canada and Anne's place in it more specifically.
Brenna, I'm wondering, what does Anne of Green Gables, or the Anne series as a whole, what do you think that is kind of teaching us about Canadian culture? Or maybe the question is it representative of Canadian culture?
I think it's hard not to answer this as a millennial specifically. Like, I think for people my age, the Anne of Green Gables TV movies and the Road to Avonlea TV series were like ubiquitous and definitely framed as a kind of understanding of what Canadian culture looked like, for better or for worse. I think also there's been a certain amount of damage done in framing maritime Canada in general, PEI in particular, as places that are like frozen in time or out of step with the mainstream. Like, yes, that's a tourist draw, but it also has like significant harm attached to it when it's already a region of the country that's often economically dispossessed. But the late Herb Wiley's Anne of Tim Hortons, which is a Marxist critique of the way Atlantic Canada is imagined as like the nation's playground, like it's this place that you go to play. So it doesn't actually matter that like we have allowed industry to die here and that people aren't perceived as being able to be like in a modern economy. That's really core to understanding why under capitalism and neoliberalism, it's like dangerous to imagine people as frozen in amber, right? Like, it's nice for your vacation, but it's not great for the people who continue to live there in the winter months when the tourists go home. So that aside, I do think that in a country that doesn't have a lot of shared cultural experiences for all the reasons that we talked about off the top, Anne is a big one, right? Like Gilbert Blythe is the nation's first boyfriend. Josie Pye, more importantly, is our first frenemy. I think they've certainly shaped the perception of Canadian cultural experience. And like Kevin Sullivan has certainly made his fortune selling a particular kind of Canadian story that's rooted in the past. And, you know, there's all kinds of reasons why nostalgic imaginings of identity, as you're both very aware, are like kind of dangerous and not great always, but they do often form a sort of root for cultural experience.
So one thing we really wanted to learn more about for this episode is something called CanCon, Canadian content. And this is really interesting to me and Ragon because this does not exist in the United States at all. This is like completely outside of our experience. But what we've learned is that in Canada, there are legal requirements for radio, television, and even internet streaming services that a certain portion of the content they broadcast be content that was at least partly written, produced, presented, or otherwise contributed to by persons from Canada. And the breakdown of how exactly those percentages play out is like very interesting to me. Like, classical and jazz radio are permitted to have a pretty low percentage of CanCon. I think it's only 20%, while the CBC has to broadcast at least 60% CanCon. How CanCon is even defined in the first place is super interesting. Like, how many Canadians need to be involved in a project to make it CanCon? Do you need like a Canadian quorum? Is this podcast
or is it more
CanCon?
like, I was gonna say, is it more like the one drop rule that like one Canadian makes a Canadian?
I can actually answer that.
If Ryan Reynolds is in a project, is it automatically CanCon?
I like the question about is this podcast CanCon because we have Canadian guests on.
Oh, it's a good question. So every industry defines it themselves, how to, but it's usually a breakdown of the creatives involved. Music is the easiest one to explain because they use a system called MAPL, as in the leaf.
Like the leaf.
But without an E. So it's MAPL, and that stands for music, artist, performance or production, and lyrics. So 2 of those 4 have to be either fully or predominantly created by a Canadian to qualify for it under CanCon law. Also, funny note, when CanCon regulations were first put into place, the first thing radio stations tried to do was just play all the Canadian content overnight. Like, we'll just cram it all into the time when nobody's listening. And people called that period beaver hours for a long time. Slightly more recent regulation, the CRTC folks were like, absolutely not. And you have to meet your CanCon requirements for radio between the hours of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. now.
And one of the reasons we wanted to bring this idea of CanCon into the conversation is because the whole point of CanCon is, at least from my understanding, right, is to preserve and protect and I think to define Canadian culture.
And that's because of us, right? Like,
yes,
because of Americans, that's fair. Canada saw what we were getting up to in our media and we're like, nope, definitely not. and fair.
Here's how I understand this, and Brenna, by all means, correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially, in the middle of the 20th century, we have like movies and TV and radio production. That's all ramping up across the globe. But the US specifically was producing so much and so quickly, and they were selling it everywhere. So I think a lot of nations considered it a very real threat to their national identities and values to be exposed just to so much American culture so fast. And then Canada, of course, sharing a language and a large national border was, I think, they felt especially at risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the Canadian government convened what was called the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters, and Sciences, which is now mostly just called the Massey Commission. And that was established in 1949 with the specific goal of evaluating the cultural landscape of Canada. So the Massey Commission was led by Vincent Massey, who was like this huge art collector, and he believed that while Canada had this incredibly rich history rooted in European traditions, it just wasn't getting the global recognition it deserved. And so he had actually spent like years sponsoring exhibitions across Europe because he felt so strongly that there needed to be like a real national commitment to supporting and promoting specifically Canadian arts and letters. I have so many questions, Brenna. So, first of all, I can't help but notice that Massey's whole idea of promoting Canadian art and letters seemed to be just intrinsically bound with European art and letters.
Absolutely. Like everyone from the time period, he was racist.
Totally. Yeah. And that's kind of what I was figuring. I'm like, okay, It's the middle of the 20th century. We haven't fully sunken into our like multiculturalism better nature.
Well, and definitely for Massey, the threat was America, right? So we go and get cultural recognition in Europe, and we connect to our cultural forebears in Europe, and we eschew the American menace that is coming up from the South. Yeah. It was far more about American cultural hegemony. And when you're a minor culture in that kind of theoretical Deleuzian sense, like not minor as in less than, but minor as in well, and particularly sharing a language, which is the thing that has always really made Canadian culture more vulnerable. It's easy to imagine cultural output simply disappearing in the face of a huge buffet from across the border. A good example of what Massey was particularly responding to, comic books, actually. Not to return to my pet project, but in the 1930s, comics were just as huge in Canada as they were in the US, and Canadian kids read all the same titles as American kids. But at the start of the Second World War, which remember Canada joined in 1939, the Wartime Exchange Conservation Act was passed. And this was effectively a rationing bill, but it also meant the limitation of quote unquote luxury goods imported from the US, including comics. So the result was not that like kids were like, well, I'm never going to read a comic again. It was a massive homegrown comics industry in Canada for the first time ever, which basically lasted for the duration of the Second World War. But when rationing was lifted and US comic books flooded back over the border again, the Weka Comics publishers folded over time. They couldn't produce their comics as cheaply as US publishers could, and they couldn't produce them as quickly because it's just a smaller population with fewer people doing the work, right? So such is the power of living next to an elephant. So CanCon is important, at least from my perspective. Not everyone agrees. There's lots of debate all the time here. But there's a reason why the biggest band in the history of Canada, the Tragically Hip, barely made a blip on the US pop culture landscape, even when Dan Aykroyd once demanded that they be his SNL musical guests or he wouldn't host. This was a band from Kingston that wrote primarily about Canadian historical references and cultural connections, so despite being excellent musicians, they didn't resonate with folks outside of Canada in the same way. And I don't think that's a dynamic that is possible without the implementation of a structure like CanCon. We all heard Tragically Hip first because, well, you had to put something on the air during that time period, and then it turned out that it resonated. Lots of one-hit wonders too, right? Like lots of bands didn't connect with people. I can think of a billion. But without the dynamic that the CanCon regulations create, you don't have the opportunities for success for a band like the Tragically Hip, I would argue.
as a result of the commission's findings, the Canadian government was like, I guess we're going to spend money on Canadian art so we can defeat the mass production coming from the US, which is great. And that means that Canada and Canadians financially back a lot of creative content. And I'm thinking about, certainly right now in our current political climate, how much of like public radio and public TV and all of those national grants supporting artists have been cut.
Dramatically so. I mean,
yeah, dramatically so.
Truly.
Certainly under our current administration. And Brenna, I don't know if this shows up on your current social media algorithm at all, but one of the things that made us start thinking about CanCon in relationship to Anne of Green Gables was because every American who watched Heated Rivalry, a Canadian television show based on a Canadian book about Canadian hockey players, and who then noticed the bit in the show's end credits where it said partially funded by Canadian taxpayers, lost their minds over the idea of an explicitly queer show being at least partially funded by the government. The most artists and creators in the US can ever rely on is maybe a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts. And again, even less so these days, and hope for the best. So just such a different experience.
I always think of the example of 1996. I remember watching the Genie Awards, the Canadian Screen Awards now, and I was 13 years old and I was watching Molly Parker win her Genie Award for her starring role in Kissed, a portrayal of a funeral home employee who was experiencing emergent feelings of necrophilia. That was the same year that David Cronenberg's Crash, also a film about necrophilia, at least in part, won 6 Genie Awards. Both of those films were federally funded. Generally, Canadians seem to be okay with this, but it is kind of odd. But I shouldn't pretend we don't have occasional cranks writing op-eds about their tax dollars. Like, we totally do. We have those people here, too. And like anywhere, neoliberal ideologies, including that of our current prime minister, tragically, he has me very worried, that puts these funding programs on the defensive. But there are remaining a number of programs from the Canada Council for the Arts that fund novel writers and artist residencies and film development and all sorts of other important cultural work in this country, and I'm grateful for it. Obviously, that's my political position, but I am grateful for it. It would be very easy, I think, for these industries to get lost in the volume that comes from the US. Like, I think it's a benefit, but certainly people who don't want to be spending their tax money on art disagree. But I think one effect of having a publicly subsidized film landscape is that films don't have to pitch towards commercial success to get funded. So the result is that Canadian films do skew quiet, they skew art house, they skew queer. Like, that works for me. People who decry the funding landscape feel the opposite. Unsurprisingly.
I think that's amazing, though, because that's one of the problems that we often hear right now in the United States about arts, which is that if it's not going to make a lot of money, then we don't do it, which means...
And that's how we have 9 quadrillion Avengers movies.
Yes. Or like
no one needs the number of Avengers movies that we have.
I was thinking about, I was going to go there, but I was going to go with the Transformers movies as movies we don't need that many of. I'm not saying like you can't go to the movies and have a great time and watch stuff blow up, like go for it. Also, then there's no room, if there's no support for it, there's no room for other things that might also be wonderful. If they don't have a guarantee that they're going to make millions opening weekend, then why do it?
Art needs time to incubate, and art needs time and money and support to incubate. We're not going to get great anything. We're not going to get great art without some sort of patronage. And right now in the US, at least, most of that patronage is coming from like private donors, you know, producers, the billionaire class. And if it was just sort of coming from the government because the government was like, well, nope, this is our quota of money to give out to artists, I'm just like, imagine what we could potentially have.
To me, you can see the impact of CanCon regulations when you look at cinemas. Like, there's no requirement for a cinema to show a certain percentage of Canadian films. And as a result, if you want to see a Canadian film on the big screen, unless it's something huge, it's probably only going to be shown at a couple of theaters, you know, in Toronto, in Montreal, and Vancouver. But you look at a screening platform like CBC Gem, which has a mandate to show Canadian film, and you can find all kinds of cool gems. We just watched this cool little film about, it was like a queer coming of age story set in a Jehovah's Witness community, and cool stuff that would probably not be particularly commercially viable, but is an interesting story to tell. And I think you see the difference in what a cinema is willing to play versus what appears on our streaming platforms. And to me, somebody with the opposite political orientation would say, well, see, nobody wants it in the cinema, so we shouldn't be forced to put it on the streamers. But I feel the opposite is true.
I'm going to tie this back a little bit because we were talking about Anne as being one of the pieces of literature that not unites Canada, but that is ubiquitous.
Yeah.
That when you've got a whole bunch of stuff under streaming services, everybody can find the thing that is interesting to them. I mean, we sometimes talk about a little bit for this generation of, oh, they don't have the same cultural experience as us of like, all watching the same TV show on Friday night.
Yeah.
And that like being a unifying cultural event, like sure, that's something we kind of lose, but I also think it's something we kind of win because now there's so much there. You can find windows into so many different things you wouldn't otherwise be able to find, stories that might not otherwise get made because they don't have to be mainstream in order to be interesting.
True. I think that inevitably leads us back to the Anne of Green Gables CBC miniseries from the 1980s, which we all grew up watching. And I'm guessing, Brenna, although correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that one of the reasons that that was as ubiquitous as it is because it's like, it's probably just the most CanCon of all CanCon, right? It's like, if you need something to fill up that 60% of space on the CBC, you are playing Anne of Green Gables. You are playing the Sullivan Entertainment version of that sort of idealized Avonlea. And so I'm wondering, when we're thinking about content that's very specifically Canadian, like Anne of Green Gables, do we think that Canadian values are then being sort of exported to the rest of the world through CanCon to the extent that we get the opportunity to watch and engage with media that's created in Canada? And if they are, what values are we talking about?
Oh, it's such a good question. This got me thinking about, and back in 2015 when Justin Trudeau was running for prime minister, and he got himself into a world of trouble by referring to Canada as the world's first post-national state. So he said that very publicly. He was actually borrowing the idea from former prime minister Jean Chrétien, said it back in 2000, and later a political writer named John Ibbitson said it as well. But Trudeau and Chrétien were framing it as something good, and Ibbitson was framing it as something bad. Personally, I like the idea. I'm not sure nationalism has a long history of good works, and rather than focusing on expressions of national identity, perhaps we are held together instead by a constellation of values. Inclusivity, diversity, openness, social welfare, care. I hope that CanCon that escapes our borders, and especially Anne and all of her reimaginings, can tell that story about Canada. Because Anne, remember, is an orphan from away with no ties to place, and that positions her as untrustworthy and other at the start of the book, right? But by the end of the book, she is the favored child of the community. And I hope that's a story about immigration and first impressions and welcome and the value of community and home. And I really hope that that is a story about Canada.
I love that, Brenna. I absolutely love that idea. And both the idea of being post-nationalist, because the U.S. has got a long way to go there.
You guys might be trying the other direction.
I know.
Doubling down.
I know.
Going hard.
Yes, I hope this is the peak of the pendulum and we're going to swing back the other way. But also that the story of Anne, an orphan and outsider who finds home and community, that being representative of Canada, because that's beautiful.
Yeah. I hope it stays that way, right? Like, we are not immune to the same kinds of authoritarian and neoliberal shifts that are affecting not just you guys, but the whole planet, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I hope we take from the story of Anne, and remember that that notion of welcome is how you get a country with a cultural mosaic like Canada's.
Brenna, we're so happy to have you. This was super fun.
It's always fun. You guys have the best podcast. I really enjoy myself here.
The conversation isn't over yet. Coming up, we have reflections on Anne of Green Gables and Canadian culture from many of our previous guests. We asked each of our Canadian guests to tell us what they think and what their experience is of Anne as a specifically Canadian icon. Now, just so you know, we recorded lots more with each guest, but in the interest of time, we're just going to share about 5 minutes from each of these conversations.
You all probably remember the amazing Andrea McKenzie from our episode about the girls of Glen St. Mary, where we talked about what Faith, Nan, and Di would have been doing during World War I, because Andrea is an expert in the Canadian nursing experience during that time period. We learned so much from her. Andrea, who is a professor at York University in Toronto, has co-edited the restored text of Rilla of Ingleside, as well as an essay collection on Ella Montgomery and war.
For me, I grew up in a tiny village of 500 people in rural Ontario. The library was one of the high points, and of course, it had Montgomery books. What I recall from those years, though, is most of the fiction for kids of my age in the library was American. The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, Cherry Ames, all of those series books. And discovering Ella Montgomery was like going to a movie and seeing your town or your city on the screen and going, wow, you recognize the familiar. So picking up a book Anne of Green Gables, for example, and reading about your own country is fascinating. It was a different era, but it was a Canadian landscape and a Canadian experience. I have to look at the rest of the books in the series, and of course, I'm going to focus on Rilla. It is still one of the best expositions of Canada's experience of the First World War. And of course, here in Canada, Montgomery is in every library, including all of our school libraries. You really can't grow up without knowing about Anne Shirley, Anne of Green Gables, Ella Montgomery. She has always been there because Montgomery is taught in some schools, Anne of Green Gables. Many embrace Anne, many don't, in the sense of they just don't think Anne is for them. But the impact on Canadian culture, for one thing, it may seem obvious, but Montgomery's birthplace, Cavendish, Prince Edward Island as a whole leapt into prominence. It did so fairly gradually, but for more than 100 years now, people have been traveling to Prince Edward Island to see Montgomery's places. That has built Prince Edward Island up, both as a tourist place. It's also creating jobs and so on and so forth. I have to say that Anne Shirley, Anne of Green Gables, and Ella Montgomery are so well known that they're icons in Canadian literature. And as with all icons, they have been parodied in the past in a good sense. That happens to all icons. I'm thinking about personal experience, but I'm also thinking about, is there a Canadian who would not recognize Anne of Green Gables? I think you'd have to look pretty hard to find a Canadian who does not recognize Anne of Green Gables. For us, Anne of Green Gables is in our background, and Montgomery is there. That's all I ever have to do, by the way. It doesn't matter what conference I'm at or what the topic is. I can walk into a nursing conference and say, oh, yes, I study Lucy Maud Montgomery, the author of Anne of Green Gables, and there's instant rapport, especially if there are women in the room. So it's a way of engagement. It's a way of making friends. It's a common shared interest. I have to say that works really well in Canada, but I've also been in the UK or in Europe, and the exact same thing happens. The thing I would add is that our perception of the First World War has been shaped in part by Ella Montgomery's Rilla of Ingleside, which was so widely read at the time and has been read by generations since. It's difficult to take what is the impact of Montgomery on Canadian culture and try and get it into, an excerpt for a podcast. There is a theme in American literature of aspiration that Horatio Alger's books, coming from around the same time. What I find interesting is that Montgomery's books, there is aspiration there. University, education, wanting to become a doctor, and finding home. There is a sense that ambition is a good thing when it leads to knowledge, friendship. At the same time, Anne's aspiration is to find a home, to find a community, and she does. For most of Montgomery's other main characters, right up to her last few books, Jane Stewart and Jane of Lantern Hill, she aspires to have a home with both parents there. Both Anne and Jane help to create that home. They transform their space. So that happens at Green Gables through Anne's personality, through Matthew, through Marilla's connivance. So there is a sense, really, of success is not necessarily about finding an upper echelon of society, as in Edith Wharton's books, for example. There is very much a sense of building community in Montgomery, of taking delight in and pleasure in the landscapes that surround you, but also in the quirks and the foibles of the people around you. Even in the middle of war, there is room for laughter, and it's usually tied to people. She is home. She is Canada. She is a specific province of Canada, but she is still ours. And so is Montgomery.
We absolutely had to talk to Laura Robinson from the University of Acadia. She had been on the pod twice, once to talk about Anne of Ingleside in the episode Anne of Ingleside in Conversation, and then again this past season in our episode on Rilla's Goodness and Growth. We always love our conversations with Laura. Laura is the current chair of the Ella Montgomery Institute's Management Committee and is a consulting editor at the Journal of Ella Montgomery Studies.
Remember when you watched TV and it ended at the end of the day and they played the national anthem? They played it for us, they did anyway. And then it went to the bars of the colors. And then after a while, it even went to snow. What they did for the Canadian national anthem is they went from sea to sea to sea and had iconic places, right? Like Banff, Alberta, Quebec City. It's the Bonhomme, like the snowman. The Blue Nose is the big Nova Scotia boat, like that's on the dime. But of course, Anne was there representing PEI. And, it's just, that's so iconic. Like when I was a kid growing up, if you went into any airport gift shop in Canada, it wouldn't matter what province you were in, there were Anne of Green Gables dolls and things. So it became synonymous with Canada. But I think really it was synonymous with PEI, which is why some PEIers are quite annoyed by Anne. It's interesting to unpack what that image means, I think, because I think it's multiple. Like there's so many meanings. If Anne of Green Gables becomes synonymous with Canadian identity, it's like, what is that identity? On one hand, it's about acceptance and tolerance, the outsider coming in and finding acceptance. Adrienne Clarkson, a former governor general who was a refugee from Hong Kong, talked about how Anne of Green Gables taught her what it meant to be Canadian, which I thought was so fascinating because it made me really think about what message does Anne give about being Canadian then. And I think some of it's so lovely, like the underdog, the acceptance, the outsider finding their place. Adrienne Clarkson talked about this sort of Scottish Presbyterian kind of mentality that she learned really from Anne of Green Gables. But on the flip side, it also is a very racially specific icon. It's very white Anglo-Celtic and Scottish Presbyterian, so a very, very certain kind of Celtic too. And I think those red braids are such signifiers, right? Like you find them everywhere. The first time I saw Anne of Green Gables, the musical, was at one of the conferences. I was sitting behind this little girl who was Indian heritage. She was standing on her seat. That's how tiny she was. And she had the hat on with the red braids. And I watched her watching the musical more than I watched the musical because she was just so gobsmacked. What was so interesting for me was seeing that image of this dark-skinned girl wearing the red braids and the straw hat. And I just thought, there's something really fascinating going on there. And I mean, we know Aretha Franklin loved Anne. We know that people see in Anne that outlier, that person that can find acceptance, which I think is a real hallmark on the surface anyway of Canadian culture, right? We're about tolerance. We are not a melting pot like the US. We are a multicultural mosaic. We grew up learning this. You do not have to give up your identity to be Canadian. You can be all the things. But on the other hand, it is very much a specific kind. I mean, it's interesting that Anne's story was the one that captured the hearts and was propelled forward by our culture. And, there's a scholar, I'm not going to remember who it is right now, who talks about Anne as a colonist, right? The colonial impulse that Anne represents too. She goes in, she renames everything, which we find delightful, the power and the agency of a child, but it's very colonialist. We know that there were probably so many indigenous, the Mi'kmaq around Cavendish, and of course there's absolute silence on that. I mean, I do think Anne is so tied to Canadian identity. The Anne books, all of them, because, it tracks Canadian history. I hope that what Anne exports about Canada is that notion of acceptance and, everyone can find a home. And I just feel that, with all the adaptations that are LGBTQ plus and racialized ones, hopefully the reason why writers are turning and graphic novelists are turning to Anne is because that message is there, right? And so it's interesting to me too that this image of Canada is embodied in a girl child, that's the message of what we are as Canadians is a girl. If you were to do the icons of Canadian culture, there would be three things: a moose, a Mountie, and Anne of Green Gables. So that's quite fascinating. Maybe a beaver. So maybe four things. That's really quite interesting that it's a girl. So there's something about a power relationship or something, but the agency that Anne has, I think, is really interesting. And I also wonder, because of course, what gets out there are the adaptations more than Anne often, right? Because people see the musical, or they've seen the Anne with an E or the CBC Sullivan production. Those are really different. The one with Megan Follows, the Kevin Sullivan one, is really nostalgic and, sweet. And then, of course, when Moira Walley-Beckett picks it up and does Anne with an E, she flips that completely and makes it very gritty and harsh, but still kind of sort of stylized and nostalgic to some degree. In some ways, the message that the Annes that are proliferating or sending out to the world about Canada might not be the same message that Montgomery had in hers. Although, why do people keep turning to Anne to tell their stories? I think there's a portability there, maybe. She's 11 at the beginning. She's she's starting to develop. So we know her life is before her. Everything's before her. And so maybe that's why that is such a powerful image, is that we're already hooked because we want to know how the possibilities will unfold. And maybe that's what it is to be Canadian. And I think maybe it's the possibilities of this girl child growing up. We see an identity will be unfurling, and the building of community, which we see throughout every single one of the Anne novels, which is maybe what being Canadian is too. That's the Canada we like to think about. Of course, there's other Canadas that isn't so lovely, and Anne probably reflects both sides of those.
Of course, we had to bring Kate Scarth to talk about this topic because she was the person who gave us this idea in the first place. You will remember Kate from our recent episode about Susan Baker this season. Kate is a professor at the University of Prince Edward Island. She is the chair of Ella Montgomery Studies with the Ella Montgomery Institute, as well as the presenter of the Life and Work of Ella Montgomery series with great courses through Audible. She's also the editor of the Journal of Ella Montgomery Studies.
Anne's story is a Canadian story because I think we can see Anne's story as one of immigration, of a person coming to a new place, a place that could be hostile. I'm thinking particularly in Avonlea, that hostility is embodied, at least initially, by Mrs. Rachel Lynde. But the immigrant, Anne in this case, makes a new life in this new place. She starts to belong to this place. She loves this new place, and she brings a lot to it, right? Contributes to too. It makes it more beautiful, more lively, more community-centered. She's at that center of that community. It also got me thinking that maybe the Canadian story is, at least in part, a story of orphans. So Anne is an orphan. The home children are referenced at the beginning when Rachel and Marilla are talking about the Cuthberts adopting a child from Nova Scotia. So the home children were children who were orphans or disadvantaged in some way. So were essentially treated like orphans because they were moved to Canada and other countries around the world. Sometimes they were adopted, but they often worked on farms, were treated essentially like indentured servants. So between 1869 and 1948, 100,000 home children came to Canada. So those are the ones that are directly mentioned in Montgomery's novel in Anne of Green Gables. So it just got me thinking about orphans or children who are treated like orphans because they're disadvantaged because of gender, class, race. That story of orphans being moved around, being often forced into new situations, new places, new lives, is one that happens within the country too. If we think of, well, orphanages like the one Anne was in, residential schools. Anne's story shows that the Canadian story, or reflects that the Canadian story, is one of immigration, but also of orphans, and how that movement is often not something that the person has control over, and that, Anne represents kind of the best case scenario where she's resilient and imaginative and finds a new life. So is also kind of an aspirational model for what Canada sometimes has been and can be. Of course, for Indigenous people, Canada is not a story of immigration. I was really struck by the speech by Wendell LeBob, who is currently the regional chief for Prince Edward Island, their Indigenous chief representing PEI. He gave this wonderful speech, very beautiful, very generous speech at the opening of the new Interpretive Center at Green Gables. So that been just before the pandemic. And Wendell LeBob talked about how Indigenous people on PEI and Abbotsford share the love of the land, of place, and of nature with Montgomery and Anne. And I think that's just a really powerful way of thinking about that. And I guess also just thinking in terms of stories of immigration, of forced migration, having Anne of Green Gables, this model of resilience and nature and place, both kind of being an outcome and a way through difficulty. The emphasis on land is so important because Canada is, I guess, fundamentally defined by land borders. And Montgomery is making the choice to lovingly describe this place, Prince Edward Island and Canada, as though they're characters in these books, and that the people and communities and stories that exist in this land are not only worth telling, but can resonate 100 years later around the world and across this country. And those stories are worth telling and will resonate, even if they're about an orphan, a child, a little girl who nobody wants. And as Antonio Michael Downing, the host of CBC's The Next Chapter, says, she went from being a child who nobody wants to being a child who everybody wants in her global reach today.
We really wanted to talk to someone who grew up on Prince Edward Island, and we had just the guest for that honor, Brenton Dickieson from the University of PEI, where he teaches literature and spirituality courses and hosts the podcast, The Modcast. That was our very first podcast swap when we recorded with Brenton in the very church that Ella Montgomery grew up attending.
So I have to distinguish, I'm a Prince Edward Islander, not just a Canadian. And so I don't really know how much relevance there is, but there are these seasonal moving up and down based on, usually a good film release of some kind, TV series or film release. And so the Kevin Sullivan film did some shooting here in Prince Edward Island, but a lot of it was made in Ontario. And if you look back at those films, you can find like Canada's comedians and actors are like in those films. And so it does have this kind of Canadian effect as like a national legacy and those sorts of things. And so we're known throughout the world partly because of Anne of Green Gables, at least in certain places. I moved to Japan, and Akage no Anne, red hair Anne, is of course famous there. And you may not know, but Prince Edward Island is not the biggest province in Canada, you know. In fact, 180,000 people, I'm not sure that we blip in the top 40 cities in the United States even or something. But like, you know, people know Prince Edward Island because of Anne. And so there is that part of the Canadianness, right? We kind of sit on a certain kind of a global map. There's people like all over China who are readers who know about Prince Edward Island, right? But they don't know anything about Saskatchewan, where Montgomery lived for a year. Prince Edward Island swings above its weight in terms of global presence. In the end, like there's a little grown factor about Montgomery sometimes growing up, but the reality is we go to the shows and those shows employ like all kinds of artists that wouldn't be able, so it ends up being part of us. You know, we do end up working in this thing or picking up this contract or opening this inn or making this connection. And then you find yourself at a, in my case as a speaker. So I end up speaking at a ladies group or something about, Montgomery, and just kind of grows from there, then becomes embeds and goes through everything. So people come to Prince Edward Island and they kind of feel like, oh, things are like authentic here. Sometimes they're a little offended that we have electricity and stuff. And so Prince Edward Island is defined by this kind of fiction. There was a stamp, right? Like a little Anne of Green Gables, Lucy Montgomery Memorial stamp. And each time there's something national that happens, it gets picked up. There really isn't any author, Margaret Atwood is awesome and she's global and all that kind of thing. But like still, Lucy Montgomery has this Canadian impact that's just everywhere in a way that like no one else has. And one of Canada Day I wrote about is Ellen Montgomery, Canada's author. I talked about what it means to be Canada's author, and I think in some ways she does, where if you read her stuff, she writes in American style prose, but she creates this picture of Canada that nobody else can. And if you read her journals, parallel, you get to see it. She's writing the Industrial Revolution. Like that is the first decades of Canada, the two world wars, the independence of the North American project, and so on. And so she gives us a window into that whole reality, which is also the formation of Canada. And then she retells it, or repaints it with certain hues. And that's, I think, what makes her probably Canada's author in that sense.
We also wanted to talk to some folks who are coming to Anne from a creative rather than a specifically academic lens. We asked Briana Corr Scott, the fantastic artist and illustrator who illustrated a recent Anne of Green Gables for Young Readers edition and who has and is currently working on illustrating covers for new bind-ups of the Anne series for her perspective. We got in depth with Briana in the episode last season called The Illustrated Anne. Briana was born and lived the first half of her life in the United States, but she moved to Canada and is now a Canadian citizen and has lived most of her adult life in Nova Scotia.
When I first read Anne, I was in the States in probably early teens, and I did not relate her to Canada at all. I really just related her to my own girlhood and the feelings of growing up. I didn't relate it to Canadian culture at all until I moved here in my 20s. And then I had this great urge to reread those books because now I knew Anne is of this place and you see Anne everywhere. And I was really curious how I would feel rereading them. And then after, rereading the series again, two things happened. One, I was in my early 20s, so I looked at Anne in a more nostalgic way towards my own girlhood. But then I really saw how she represented Canada, but I'm trying to put my finger on what is Canadian about her. I think Canadians have just adopted her as this symbol of, I want to say cottagecore, but that's not the right word. She's like this cottagecore, idyllic person from PEI that I think especially Maritimers all relate to all of their own childhoods, what it's like being in Canada. And then to really see how people from Japan and Asian countries really loved Anne as well, like learning about that once I was in Canada and realizing that this idea of like coming from an island and coming from a small community and interactions with your neighbors and that kind of cottagecore pastoral life really related to other cultures. It almost like reflected back on the Canadianness of it, like seeing it through someone else's eyes and seeing all the tourists that come in. It's like seeing your own culture reflected back to you. in a way. I feel her so deep in my heart as like that lover of girlhood and lover of nature and lover of like whimsy and innocence and imagination and hopefulness. Like I feel her on a soul level. And then there's this commercial level that you have to acknowledge exists, right? And just the way she's like a Mickey Mouse character for Canada in a way, you know? So it has influenced it visually because you can't drive around PEI without seeing red pigtails and the hat everywhere. So you have to say she's left a mark. Like visually, she's left a mark. People claim her, people love her. And I guess my hope is they love her on that soul level too, you know? And I wonder, do they really know her, or is this just like for the tourism? You know, I wonder that. And then that's a funny question because it's like, well, who am I to think I know Anne so well? But isn't that how we feel? Like if you love the Anne books, like that's how you feel, like she's your friend, you know her. And as an American, I guess my feeling of being American living in Canada, I relate to Anne in a very specific way where I find Anne to be outspoken. Like she always says what she thinks. She says the wrong thing. She puts her foot in her mouth. And that's very un-Canadian to me. You know, she's not as polite as the Canadians, you know, typically are. Like she tries her best, but she's always kind of flubbing it, right? And I think I feel that way, like as an American in Canada, I'm always putting my foot in my mouth or making a joke at the wrong time or oversharing way too much. And some people like it. Sometimes I just feel so odd. So I think she's kind of an odd one to be a Canadian because she's not how I see Canada as an outsider.
You haven't heard this voice before, but friend of the pod, Jennifer Villaverde, is a Filipino-Canadian actor, arts educator, and hockey mom. I think that's the Canadian trifecta. She has been acting for over 25 years and has appeared in productions across Canada. She's currently in her 4th season as a member of the acting company at the Stratford Festival in Canada, and she spent the bulk of last year being immersed in Avonlea in the amazing production of Anne of Green Gables that we can't stop raving about. Jennifer was pretty much every supporting character. She played Mrs. Barry, Prissy Andrews, and our favorite, Miss Stacy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Villaverde. I am recording this from Stratford, Ontario, Canada, where I am based. And I'm also in the acting company this season at the Stratford Festival, where I am doing 3 shows in rep, The Hobbit, Death of a Salesman, and a new play called Tao of the World. I'm pretty positive it was the miniseries starring Megan Follows and my first boyfriend, Jonathan Crombie. Rest in peace, Jonathan Crombie. I so wish you were still with us. Gosh, he was cute, wasn't he? That's how it started. And then, of course, I had to read the entire series. I got the box set, was so obsessed with Anne and her journey. And then I'm going to age myself, in 1995, I was cast in the young company of the Charlottetown Festival, resulted in my Anne of Green Gables journey to continue. But every year, the Charlottetown Festival does Anne of Green Gables, the musical. And I was not in that. I was in the young company. We did like a 45-minute outdoor musical about how awesome Canada is. It was very cheesy, but people loved it and we loved doing it. And the main stage company did Anne of Green Gables, the musical. And as part of the company at large, we got to see the show whenever we wanted. So I saw it so many times because, of course, I was obsessed. I was so young, and whenever I would see it, I would just become like a feral audience member, like whooping after every dance number, after every song, just totally unprofessional and unhinged. But it didn't end there. I went back in 96 and 97. So I saw 3 different Annes. Each actor was just so brilliant and so fun and so full of life. It was also a very eye-opening experience. I had no idea how obsessed the world was with Anne. We would get planefuls, busfuls of tourists seeing Anne of Green Gables. So many people from Japan. That was where I learned that of Japan's obsession with Anne. And I was just like, I get it. I get it. And then, of course, I did the production of Anne of Green Gables last season, 2025. And it was an experience of a lifetime. That was such a beautiful, beautiful show. PEI is such a special place, and it's, fun fact, the birthplace of Canada. So when you read the book and Lucy Maud Montgomery, when she, through Anne's eyes, describes the beauty of PEI, there's no place like it in all of Canada but in PEI. So I guess if anyone reading the book who is not from Canada, when they read it, they are getting such a clear illustration of the beauty of PEI, the nature, like the island, being cradled in the ocean, the waves, the sand dunes. She paints such a beautiful picture of that island. And so anyone reading it might think this is all of Canada, but it's not. When I arrived in PEI for the first time in 95, I couldn't believe how accurately Lucy Maud Montgomery painted that picture for me and for everyone who has read her books. I wish I could speak more articulately about how Anne has influenced Canadian culture. I just think we just have such an ownership of her story. We just think, yeah, Anne is Canada. Does Anne represent something specific about the Canadian culture, identity, history to you? If so, how? Wow, another big question. I'm going to answer it from a very personal place, and I don't know, I guess in terms of Canadian culture, it's more about my own personal identity as a child of immigrant parents who later became Canadian, who got their Canadian citizenship. So it was so immediately special to me when I first saw the miniseries and I first read the books. And I immediately identified with her, even though I look nothing like her. I'm Filipino, by the way. Yeah, I'm definitely not a redhead. But my culture is so beautiful in many, many ways, but it's also heavily influenced by the patriarchy, like a lot of cultures. And because I was born a girl, my parents thought through old wives' tales, when my mom was pregnant, they thought I was a boy. And when I came out as a girl, I don't want to say they were disappointed, but I think they really wished I came out as a boy. They had a name picked out and everything. When I arrived, I couldn't be named with the name they had chosen. It was Starsky, by the way. Yes, from Starsky and Hutch. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise that I came out as a girl. And they freaked out and it was like, Jennifer. So I grew up knowing that they had always wanted a boy. And when I was introduced to Anne Shirley, and when she arrives in PEI and is picked up by Matthew, and she realizes that she wasn't who they expected, and she says, "You don't want me because I'm not a boy," that hit home so hard. And to me, my identity as a child of immigrant parents who come from a culture heavily influenced by the patriarchy, the sadness that comes out of knowing that being a girl is disappointing, that really hit home. And even in the show that we did last year, whenever she would say that line, it hit home pretty hard. And then, of course, when they decided to keep her, it was just like, my heart couldn't take it. Such a beautiful moment of belonging. And when you're a kid, you just want to feel like you belong to the family you're with. So to relate to Anne in that way was very, very moving. I think that's why I love her so much, because I felt like in a small way I was Anne.
And who better to share her perspective than Caroline Toal, the actress that spent 9 months of her life inhabiting Anne at the Stratford production last year. We absolutely adored Caroline's Anne. She was instantly recognizable, but she also brought her own spirit and interpretation to Anne. You can hear more from Caroline in our episode, Applause for Anne.
The story is so relatable, so it is hard to pick out something that's specifically Canadian. However, I would say a lot of us in this country are settlers who have come from different places. So I think that's specific, like Anne's kind of settler identity of being different and being from somewhere else is a huge part of Canadian identity. We have so many different kinds of people living in Canada, specifically in like the more metropolitan areas, and needing to get along with one another and accept one another. So that in particular is something that I think is specifically Canadian. Yeah. So I'm not from the East Coast, but I have visited, and I feel like her connection to the land, specifically like the East Coast, PEI, obviously, there's nowhere like PEI. It's so magical. And the author does such a great job she does such an amazing job of describing it, and Anne's like love of it. And to me, I feel the same way about Northern Ontario. For me personally, like I feel a huge, deep connection to the nature of Northern Ontario, because that's where I spent a lot of my childhood, like every summer. Although that can probably be anywhere, it does feel specifically Canadian to me. I think certainly for the people who've grown up with Anne, a big part of Canadian identity, at least how I feel about it, is acceptance. Acceptance, because there's a lot of different people here, and it's it's a vast country with people living very, very spread out and very different climates. There's a lot going on. So I think acceptance is a big part of it. But it's interesting because when I was doing Anne, the theater show, like I met so many Canadians who had never read Anne because it's no longer in schools. I think at one point it was. So I think for some people it is a huge part of our identity, and maybe that has seeped in without people who haven't read it, and maybe it's seeped in and they don't know. Or I think when I talk about the acceptance of being a huge value, I want to believe that's true of Canadian culture. I want to believe it's one of our more positive attributes, I hope.
And our last guest is Kat Sandler, the award-winning Canadian writer and director and now showrunner, most notably of the incredible Anne of Green Gables play from Stratford Festival last year. We were able to catch up with Kat quickly by phone, so the audio is not the highest quality, but we loved what she had to say and wanted to share it all with you.
I do think of Anne as specifically Canadian, but I think mostly because we're pretty terrible in Canada at claiming things and carving out things as like distinctly ours, even things that, originate here and are like geographically based here. And I think Anne is it's certainly one of the first and most well-recognized pieces of Canadian literature that most of us encountered in our youth. But I think it's also I'm not sure how to articulate this correctly. Like there's the ideals in the book and in the story, they feel Canadian in a way that like community and belonging and kindness and doing the right thing. But it's also it's a different kind of pride than what I think Americans are really good at, which is like pride in the place that you're born and like really anything. You guys are really, really good at pride. But this is like pride in the way that you act and the way that you love that I think feels to me as a Canadian very distinctly Canadian. There's something I want to blow this up. But I haven't thought about it in so long in talking about like what makes a Canadian and why like love is important and the way that those characters and the way that it's written. Like it's about love in a way that feels Canadian too, but I can't explain how. Like that it's about allowing and making room for different kinds of love rather than like making something of yourself. It's like accepting different kinds of love that feels Canadian to me. I think Canada does a good job of holding us in terms of teaching the world about us and our ideals. But I think it's nice to have touchstones of certain heroines that are heroes or heroines or pieces of IP that like really seem to espouse the ideals that are important to us in like on like a political global scale. Like I think it's like we do really claim Anne, which is awesome. When I travel, I try to find a book, like an Anne of Green Gables book in whatever new country that I go to in that language. And I feel like a little bump of joy to see this like very Canadian book and story translated into so many languages and existing in such different ways.
So let's wind up our conversation with Brenna with an inspired by Anne and inspired by Canada section. Brenna, enlighten us. What are your favorite examples of CanCon?
Okay, so when we were talking about this before, we've got kind of like music, TV, and movies. So I stayed in that framework. So music, this is a niche. You have to find us in a used record store somewhere in Canada at this point, probably. But back in the 90s, there was actually early 2000s, I think, there was a box set made called Oh, What a Feeling, which is a lyric from a Canadian kind of rock song from the 80s. And it was 4 CDs of songs that had won Junos over the previous, I don't know, it's like the 5th anniversary of the Junos or something. It very aptly captures the period of Canadian music most impacted by CanCon, and it has some of those great one-hit wonders that would only get there because of CanCon regulations, and then it's got some like great cuts from folks like the Tragically Hip, so I recommend that. Television, I recommend Degrassi. Obviously Degrassi. Degrassi's a great example of a show that emerged because of those CanCon regulations, right? Like the CBC was commissioning stuff to fill time, and teenagers were just becoming a demographic with money, and that was very exciting. And then it's, snowballed for multiple generations now. Also, 2 great shows because of how weird they are. Everybody knows Schitt's Creek. That one went crazy big in the US, but also
we love Schitt's Creek.
Oh, it's so good. It's so cozy. I've still actually not watched the finale because in my headcanon the show is not over, so I can't watch the very last episode. One day.
What?
Maybe. Yeah. Now it's on forever. I don't know when the next episode's coming out, but eventually, because I haven't watched the last one. And Being Erica, which was this great show from the early 2000s, I guess, about this woman. She's in her mid-20s. She's working in publishing. She's made kind of a mess of her life, and she meets this man who can let her travel back in time to like revisit moments of her life. And it sounds extremely cheesy, and at moments it is, but it's also like I've cried more episodes of Being Erica than any other piece of television out there. So highly recommend that one. Yeah, it's a good one. And then I got carried away with movies.
Thank you.
Women Talking, which is Sarah Polley's adaptation of a Miriam Toews novel about a Mennonite community. Last Night, which is my favorite Canadian film of all time and the most Canadian take on the apocalypse imaginable. It's especially delicious because it came out the same year as, I don't know, the one where Bruce Willis stops the meteor from hitting America.
Armageddon?
Yeah, same year as that. And it's just a very different take on what the end of the world might look like. Mostly it's just a lot of people having sex and doing drugs. Bon Cop, Bad Cop, which is a super fun Two Solitudes experience. It's really fun if you're bilingual because the dialogue is in English and French, but it's also subtitled either way. And it's a really good reflection on how French and English Canada kind of coexist in the same place but remain isolated from each other. And then 2 recent incredible examples of Indigenous filmmaking in Canada. Rhymes for Young Ghouls, which is a very unsettling reflection of residential school experience and its ramifications, and Beans, which is a coming-of-age drama set against a very specific political uprising in Quebec in the 90s. But both just like letter-perfect films. Really enjoyed them both.
Those are great recommendations, Brenna. I am ashamed to add my own paltry recommendations when you've given us such a great bounty.
No, go for it.
Well, I think we can't talk about Canadian music without talking about our high priestess, Carly Rae Jepsen.
I took a group of youths to Wales in 2012, and they made Call Me Maybe the like official song of being drunk on a bus and screaming it at the top of their lungs. And I don't love that song any less for that experience. So that tells you something about the genius of Jepsen.
Let me tell you about that song. That was the song of the summer when I was pregnant with my daughter. And weirdly, that is like the song of like pregnancy for me. Like when I just met you, I don't know, like I haven't met you, that whole thing where I was like, oh yeah, maybe it's about my baby. I don't know.
Really. Call me baby.
Right. I was like, well, my baby to call me.
Adorable.
Reagan, that's so cute.
That's really cute.
The 2 songs that I remember from pregnancy that imprinted on Alice in the womb were Call Me Baby and Starships by Nicki Minaj.
That's how
honestly,
you got a drama
both
kid.
Bangers. And of course, I have to return back to, that great early aughts indie rock that was coming out of Canada. I'm so tempted to like make a Spotify playlist. If anybody cares at all and wants to hear that, hit us up and let me know. I would be happy to.
It was such a good era for like, let's have 400 people in a band. Like, let's
just like the super group of it all. Like,
there's a guy walking down the street. Can he play the tambourine? Let him join. What the heck?
Let him join. And like the new pornographers. So it's just like this incredible time of like amazingly creative folks. So if you haven't done a deep dive into like the broken social scene of it all, or the new pornographers, or like, of course, like Arcade Fire, do yourself the biggest favor and jump into some of that golden era can rock.
I can never hear the song Mass Romantic by New Pornographers without remembering that it is like the main song in the trailer for this film about curling called Men with Brooms.
What?
Which has anything been more Canadian?
Right?
Definitely CanCon.
My favorite Canadian TV show is Orphan Black.
Oh, nice.
Such a great movie where Tatiana Maslany plays a bunch of clones. Yeah. So she literally plays a cast of thousands all by herself, and she's freaking amazing. But a more sort of recent show that if you guys aren't watching, I hope you do, is North of North.
Oh, so good.
It's so good, right?
Yeah.
That was great.
It is one of those it's one of those sitcoms that, like a Schitt's Creek, that I just love, where it's sort of like the stakes are like fairly low as things
people
go.
Are kind.
People are kind. The community it's representing is a community you wish you could live in. And, it's specifically set in like a far north Indigenous community in Canada. And there's just a lot of stuff where these are the ways that these folks are just like everybody everywhere. And also these are the ways that their way of life is extremely unique to their geography and cultural traditions.
Yeah.
It's great watching. And then the good Canadian movie that I would broadly recommend, Take This Waltz. Is this CanCon just because Seth Rogen is in it?
Sarah Polley directed it.
Sarah Polley directed, of course.
Yeah.
But this is a great one. One of these sort of like domestic movies about like a marriage in trouble. And it's just lovely. Like a slice of life in Toronto marriage in trouble movie. Beautiful performances from Michelle Williams and Seth Rogen.
So I highly recommend Sarah Polley's memoir if you haven't read it. It's called Running Towards the Danger. She talks about the making of that film in it. She also talks about making Road to Avonlea, which, that was not a set for children. But also her documentary, if you've never seen it, The Stories We Tell, is phenomenal. It's all about sort of, she begins to wonder, based on family lore, whether her dad is actually biologically her dad. She starts down a journey of trying to figure that out. It's an incredible documentary.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
I did not specifically go with media, but I do have a Canadian author because I have been on a cozy fantasy bender. So I am going to recommend Heather Fawcett. We have already recommended her middle grade novel, The Grace of Wild Things, which is a magical interpretation of Anne of Green Gables. Gorgeous, beautiful. And both Kelly and I love her Emily Wilde books, which are about professors who research the fairy world. But I just read her newest book, which is called Agnes Aubert's Mystical Cat Shelter. And it takes place in a magical Montreal. And it's a lovely read. It's got wizards and magic battles and kitten rescues and a love story. And it's very Montreal, like historical Montreal, but magical.
I was delighted to see this recommendation because I actually just bought this on a whim in the last Kobo sale. So I'm excited. Jumped much higher on because I tend to like hoard things after the Kobo sales. So this has just jumped up to the top of my list.
Oh, it's a lovely read. It really hit the spot when I was I was on kind of a cozy fantasy bender. I did like 5 in a row and they were exactly what I wanted. This was lovely. And especially because I'm fostering kittens, it felt like it was the right read right now.
Amazing.
I love Heather Fawcett.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brenna. What a treat it has been to chat with you again. We're not going to wait another 2 years before we have you back on the podcast.
I won't have any more kids either.
Yeah, well, I mean, you do you. That's fine. We'll work with your schedule. The next season is Emily. So if you think you're going to have any great Emily thought, hit us up.
Oh, that's exciting.
But so, Brenna, where can our listeners find you on the internet if they want to do that?
I have whittled down my social media presence, so I'm now just at Brenna C. Gray on Blue Sky, or you can listen to me every Tuesday if you subscribe to Hazel and Katniss and Harry and Star.
And I recommend that people do,
because I love your podcast.
Brenna, so happy to have had you. We have had the best time talking to you. And yeah, thank you for being here.
Always fun.
Well, Kindred Spirits, we still have one more episode in our regular season in store. So continue to look for a new episode in our podcast feed, as well as we will have some summer bonus episodes coming your way from the Ella Montgomery Conference, where we will be going in June. Kindred Spirits, thank you so much for spending time with us. Don't forget, if you want to support the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating or review. It's the easiest way to help us grow. Always feel free to email us at kindredspirits.bookclub@gmail.com or find us on Instagram at kindredspirits.bookclub. Until next time, Kindred Spirits.